Welcome to Mahoosuc Land Trust Habitat for All online class. I'm Barbara Murphy, staff member with Mahoosuc Land Trust. Joining us today is my husband Mike Murphy. He's going to talk about how do you get those plants for your pollinator garden? Should you start them from seed? What if you buy them? Are there characteristics you should look for? Mike and I ran Wake Robin Nursery for 10 years. It was a nursery that specialized in rare plants from around the world, as well as plants that benefited pollinators, like what we're dealing with today, birds, butterflies, and bees.
Hello, I'm out here in our little greenhouse that we use for seed starting. It's this little greenhouse that I made about 15 years ago. It's 12 by 18 feet, and the plastic on the top is made out of wood. And it's a great little greenhouse, especially in late February, early March, when you can first get outside. The sun is enough to warm this up, so to come out with a cup of coffee and start thinking about gardening early in the year. This is like the nerve center for that kind of thing. So it's really nice to have a little greenhouse if you could ever build one. It doesn't even need to be this big. What I'm going to talk about today are the plants that you would use for your pollinator gardens. And I'd like to split the videos into two parts. The first part is really about the merits of starting from seed versus starting from plants. And then the second part, I'll get into which plants would you actually choose. We're in because this is late April and the clock is kind of ticking here. In another month we could be out planting our perennial, our pollinator gardens. There's certain things that you still have time to do and other things that you still don't. And in particular, in terms of starting from seeds, what you really can't do this time of year is you can't start a lot of the seeds that may be available through catalogs, through companies, because they require a cold period. They require the seeds to be sown in a pot, like a lot of these seeds that I've sown. Actually were sown, this was sown last October, and it had to go through a cold period. So these have been outside in a protected area so mice can't eat the seeds, and they've frozen solid for most of the winter. And only after those conditions, a long, prolonged cold period, will they germinate. So you obviously can't do that because here it is late April and the clock is ticking. But what you can do is you can grow the kinds of seeds that require a warm period, like a lot of the vegetables that you grow. They just need a warm period, and I'll talk about which ones need warm, which ones need cold, that kind of thing. So let's see. Oh, actually, I should mention some of the plants here that are sitting in front of me, and there's a good reason why I brought these out. These plants here are called Corydalus solida. It's a European native. This one's Corydalus malcensis, and the reason that I chose to put those on the bench, other than that they're gorgeous, and they're also blooming in the garden. They've been freezing solid and coming through just fine over the last couple of weeks, is that this is a plant that the early emerging bumblebees, the bumblebees that spend the whole winter underneath leaves, those queen bumblebees, and they're just emerging now, going around looking for some food, looking for a place to create a nest. They're ravenously hungry. They need to eat, and if they're going to survive. And this is a plant that's just perfect for them. They spend a lot of time foraging these in the garden, and these spread by seed throughout the garden. Not invasive spreading, but they will spread and pop up here and there in the garden. It's quite delightful because they actually will hybridize in the colors. You'll get all these interesting colors. So it brings up a point, and a lot of people ask this right off the bat. Should I grow just native plants? If I'm planting a perennial garden, should I plant a mixture? And my take on it is that first you should take the do no harm kind of credo, where you don't want to plant something that may be good for pollinators. And I don't know if you've ever noticed, but Japanese knotweed, the bamboo-like plant that grows on the roadsides and spreads like crazy, when that flowers in the late summer, it is covered with bees, covered with pollinators. And so is it a good pollinator plant? You bet. Would you plant it in your garden? Absolutely not. So the first thing I think of is when I'm evaluating some kind of a seed, all these seed packets that have come from all far-flung places, seed companies, and I trade seeds with people, is if I plant this in my garden, is it going to take over? And that's where I want to do a little bit of research. So that's the first thing. So before I even get to the native, non-native sort of question there, I want to know that if I plant this, it's not going to do any harm. The second thing to think about with native versus non-native is that native insects, the insects that you find in our region, are adapted to the plants that are here. So the quality of nectar, the quality of pollen, it's something that they count on. You know, they're foraging anyway on these plants. So if you can include them in your garden, that's a good thing. But is that the only thing? We're increasingly going to talk about butterflies and moths in addition to the bees, and so we'll include them all in a group. And for the butterflies and moths in particular, we know that those caterpillars, when they lay eggs on plants, those caterpillars are very specific about what they want to eat. And you may have encountered, let's say, the caterpillars of black swallowtails, say, on your parsley or on your dill plants. They're very particular about feeding on plants in those families. And so something that's native might be a plant called zizia, or maybe Queen Anne's lace. Not really sure about that. I haven't seen a lot of feeding on Queen Anne's lace. But those are related plants, and they won't feed on things that are different. They're not going to feed on the plants that are on this table here. They're just too different. So in terms of native versus non-native, you're going to have to look very specifically at what the caterpillars of some butterflies and moths require for plants and plant those. And we'll get into some of that research and kind of identify some of those. But beyond that, what I try to do, because the impacts, Barb has explained to you some of the impacts on bees especially, the impacts on them is so significant that we want to include as many plants as possible, as early in the growing season and as late in the growing season, on all different types of flowers to accommodate all the different types of native bees that we have. So I'm just thinking, this is a great plant. It's not native, but I want to include it because I know it's one of the few plants that I can have in April that's going to flower, that will attract those early bumblebees that are just coming out of hibernation, just those queens. So we'll talk more and more about the native, non-native kind of a thing. What's important is to recognize that it's not this dichotomy where you're either with us or against us. As gardeners, we have to do what's interesting to us and include lots of things in our garden to sort of keep it fresh. And so there's lots of different strategies. There isn't necessarily one right way, one wrong way. Okay, at least that's our take. So in terms of growing from seed versus going and buying plants to populate your garden, your pollinator garden, one of the things about pollinator gardening is oftentimes you're creating a whole garden from scratch. I've got a 10 by 15 foot area and I want to load it with pollinator plants. How many plants is that going to be? It might be 50, it might be 75 plants. And if you had to buy those at a garden center at $10 or $15 or more per plant, it's going to cost you a lot of money. That may be okay with you because then you have plants that are large enough to just go boom in the landscape, and they'll root and they'll probably flower that first year, and you've got this sort of instant garden in a way. With seeds, it's definitely going to be slower. But take a look at this. This is a flat of purple coneflower, Echinacea purpurea, and there's probably 200 seeds in there. And you notice that they're really kind of clumped together. In about 2 weeks, I will get in here and I will start to transplant these in clumps. And Barb's going to talk about transplanting in a separate video. But I'll probably get 40 clumps of plants out of here. I'll sow them in little pots, some of these little 4-pack, something like this, and I'll have lots of plants. What's that cost me? A packet of seeds, $2.50. The caveat is that those plants are going to stay small. I'm going to grow them out in here, and then maybe by, I'd say the middle of June, something like that, they'll be ready to go in the garden. How much will they grow in that first year? Well, it'll probably look something like this. This is a penstemon, but this is about what it looks like the following year, or in your garden it would look like this. I overwinter plants in my frames, so this has just come out of this was frozen all winter. So this is about the size of a 1-year-old plant. When I set this in the ground, it'll start growing like crazy, and especially the late bloomers, the echinaceas, the rudbeckias, the liatris, all these plants, they may flower in that second year, but they won't flower. These will not flower in their first year, so it's waiting a year. But economically, you're way ahead if you go from seed. The other thing about growing from seed is that there are a lot more kinds of plants available. I buy a lot of seeds from nonprofits like the Wild Seed Project in Portland, Maine, or Prairie Moon Nursery. I've been buying from Prairie Moon Nursery since they first started decades ago, and there are hundreds of kinds of seeds in this catalog. So you're not going to find that kind of diversity in your garden centers, in local nurseries, even on online nurseries. The good thing about some of these nurseries, if they're big enough, like Prairie Moon, is they'll also sell you little plants. If you only need a few of a certain thing, and you don't want a whole flat's worth of seedlings. And they may be 1-year-old plants, so they'd be much larger. So you have that diversity. You can choose, all sorts of grasses and all sorts of different rudbeckias and echinaceas that you don't normally see that are native plants. And the same is true just of regular perennials and of annuals as well. So you get that diversity. I also think that growing from seed is really interesting. It gives me something to do in March and in April when there's nothing else to do garden-wise. I've already gone through the seed catalogs in the dead of winter, and I've got the seed packets, and so in March and in April I can start seeds. Now, we don't heat this greenhouse that we're in. This is not what you think of as a greenhouse where you'd find houseplants and that sort of thing. We heat it supplementally with a little heater just when the mornings are cold, but a lot of our seeds we start indoors under lights. And so Echinacea purpurea is a native plant that will germinate under warm conditions. So these were just sown probably about 2.5 weeks ago. So this is fairly recent. So you'd be sowing them at the same time you'd be sowing your tomatoes or your peppers, and they size up. You can see they're pretty robust little seedlings. These are going to grow quickly. So we're growing them under lights. So if you start from seed, you're going to have to think, do I already have lights, where I start my vegetable starts? Do I need to do that? And then once they're under lights, you need to remember to water them and turn the lights on and off. And so there's a greater degree of care, which I like. I like that hands-on nature of starting seeds. But you have to think about that. Is that something you have time for? And I already mentioned one of the cons of growing from seed is that it takes, a full extra year to get a flowering plant. And in many cases, some plants, I think of like Baptisia and some others that I grow, it might take 2 years for that plant flowers in your garden. So you need to, leave space around it. It is going to grow large, but you do have to wait for it. So that's one thing to think about. So growing from plants, the good thing about plants is they're ready to go. If you go to your garden center and you buy a big plant, this is a daylily. Actually, it's a wild daylily from Japan. But if you go to your garden center and buy a plant that's this big and there are roots hanging out the bottom, then you're ready to go. You put that in your garden, especially if it's a late blooming plant like an aster or something like that, it will be a full mature plant. We learned this lesson in the Pollinator garden at Valentine Farm when Barb got all these plugs. We grew about 2/3 of the plants for the Pollinator garden, and then Barb bought some others that we didn't have access to. And we planted all these little plants in the garden, even smaller than this, all close together in a tight little cluster. And then the following spring, they started to grow and they got huge. We had to quickly move them into place in the garden, and by the end of the year, they were really huge. Yeah, and it was an impressive garden. People walked around and took pictures and spent a lot of time there. The disadvantage of plants is that there's far fewer kinds that are available, especially locally. You may have to buy through some online source. So they're going to be more expensive, and if you need, like I mentioned, 50 or 75 or 100 plants, then you're going to spend a lot if you get fully mature plants. The other thing about plants, and this is something that in the last few years, in the last 10 years at least, has become really a consideration, is you have to ask the plants that you may buy in a nursery, have they been treated with pesticides? And the pesticide that we're especially concerned about is one called neonicotinoids. It's a class of pesticides. And the thing that makes them very distinctive is that if they're sprayed on a plant, or the seed is actually treated with the insecticide, that insecticide grows into the plant, and it actually is secreted in the nectar, and could even be secreted in the pollen, so that when a pollinator comes and starts to forage in the flowers, it's being poisoned. So that's something to consider. So nurseries need to be right up front about that, and in some cases, some of the big box stores have new policies where they're saying that we're not going to sell plants that have been treated with neonicotinoids. And but if you go to a nursery, you need to ask, and either your answer is either no, they have not, definitely not been treated, or yes, they have. If it's in the middle, don't really know, because we bought the seed, the plant starts from someone else, and we don't really know, don't buy them. Just don't. It's not worth it, especially since what we're trying to do here by creating a pollinator garden is a conservation effort. We're trying to provide for pollinators because they're disappearing, and so you don't want to plant a garden that poisons them. So that's really important. So in terms of sizes, what's available, you may, a nursery like Prairie Moon, and there are others, and we'll put a list of resources down below, a little document that you can open up below this video. They sell different types of plants. They sell plants that are grown in little 4-packs like this. They sow the seeds early on in a greenhouse, probably March or so. And when you get them in May or June, they're little plants, probably only 4 months old. They're pretty inexpensive, $2 or $3 a piece, something like that. Some nurseries will sell you plugs in a little bit larger pot like this that they call landscape ready plugs, and they many times are a year old. And so those are a little bit more expensive. In some cases, you can actually get bare root plants that will come early on, where you get 20 plants wrapped in a fistful of sphagnum moss, and they're ready to plant out in pots so that the roots can establish themselves. So that's a couple of things to think about. The seeds, you get the diversity, you get the enjoyment of it. It's inexpensive. Plants are more expensive. But they're ready to go, and that's a really important thing. So what I'll do is the next video, I'll talk about some of the plants that, because it's late in the year, because it's so late in the spring, what can you still hope to accomplish if you want to start your own seeds, for example, or if you want to go and buy plants from a nursery, where can I get those pretty quickly, so that by early June, you'll be ready to go in to plant your garden. So let's see, anything else? Nope, I think that's it for now. And so look at the little link down below for sources, maybe a few extra things that I forgot. And I'll post in a few days another video of which plants I would recommend sort of in the short term. What we could also do late in the summer, we'll post a different video on how to actually gather seeds and start those late germinators, the ones that need the cold period to actually germinate, so that you can start them, put them in your refrigerator to simulate the winter, and I'll show you how to create a little holding bed for them if you want to keep them outside so that the mice can't eat them. So that's it for now. Thanks.